Hello, you. You're listening to A History of Italy. Episode 196, Giovanni of the Black Bands, Part 1, Birth of a Legend.
E così ritorno su, lascio I colli nelle valli, tra due salici piangenti, io ritrovo la speranza di un amore che ormai fu.
Before we begin, a little announcement. On the 3rd of January 2026, A History of Italy podcast will turn 8 years old. Also, more or less at the same time, we will reach episode 200. Now, you may remember that for episode 100, I had the great pleasure of interviewing what we consider the grandfather of history podcasting, although the age is not in line with the title, Mike Duncan of the History of Rome and Revolutions podcasts. Now, I got to thinking, what important person could I invite for episode number 200? It did not take me long at all to think of who the absolute most important person was for me and the podcast, and that, of course, is you, my dear constant listener. That is why I have decided that episode 200 and the 8th birthday episode will be the listener's episode. So I'm issuing a call for contributions. Please send in an audio file if you feel like it, or something for me to read about the podcast, something that you enjoyed, or some extra considerations, something I haven't mentioned. I already have some of these stored aside, and apologies if I haven't answered to them, and I'll be reading them as we go along. So, once again, send me in an audio file if you feel like having your voice on the air, or if you're a bit shy, go ahead and just write it in with your favorite part, remembering old episodes, remembering old sketches, or some sort of contribution that you would like to add to the podcast. Thank you very much if you decide to do so. It's always nice to visit with old friends whom we have left behind, as we continue to attempt to unravel the twisting narrative of the history of this complicated boot of a country that I call home. That is why I'm particularly pleased to go back and see our old friend Caterina Sforza, the Tigress of Forlì. We find her on the 6th of April, 1498, at the end of her 4th pregnancy. She was giving birth to the son of her 3rd husband, Giovanni de Medici, known as Il Popolano, of the people, from a cadet line of the Medici family. The boy was born with the name Ludovico, in honor of Caterina's uncle, Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza. However, when his father died in September of that same year, his name would be changed to Giovanni. Upon his birth, aside from Ludovico, his mother is reputed to have picked him up, looked at him and said that he was un Gran Diavolo, a great devil. Whether true or not, it was considered to be true, and the name would get around and stick. His was a life surrounded by conflict, and not only physical. Early on, as we know, his mother was ousted from her holdings by Cesare Borgia and was imprisoned by him. Once she had been released and made her way to the city of Florence, she had to fight for the custody of her son against a member of the main branch of the Medici, Lorenzo, not the Magnificent, of course. She first tried to hide the little boy in a convent dressed as a girl, but Lorenzo managed to get his hands on him, and Caterina did not get him back until she won the legal battle in 1504. With her boy finally by her side, she could now fill his head with the legends of Sforza ancestry, Muzio Attendolo, the great condottiero, and Francesco I, Sforza, Duke of Milan. She also tried to educate him with the few tutors she could afford, but he was not at all interested in books, to the point that he would run away or even hit his tutors. He was more interested in violence and blood, much to the lethal danger of any small animals he could get his hands on. Nowadays, he may have ended up in an institute rather than leading a mercenary company. At the age of 6, he was gifted a horse, which he immediately jumped on and rode off. His mother, Caterina, died when he was only 11, and he would take her memory with him, making her enemies his and showing gratitude to her benefactors. One of the few books he was interested in would be his mother's Experimenti, from which he would take all sorts of potions and remedies that he used. He was sent to live with the family of a cousin of his father, Lucrezia de Medici, one of the daughters of the Magnificent, and her husband from the noble Salviati family, Jacopo. They had a daughter, Maria, and she and Giovanni would grow up together and eventually be married, fulfilling Maria's dream, a dream that would be part nightmare for the meek and pious young girl. From a dynastic point of view, after Giovanni himself bringing together the Sforza and Medici, this marriage would unite the cadet branch of the Medici with the main one, descending from Giovanni de Medici to Cosimo the Elder, Lorenzo the Magnificent, and so on. It is around this time, as a pre-adolescent, that Giovanni started to get into fights, his first probably being in a brothel, where he also had another first of his experiences, one which would become his second favorite pastime after making war. Things got even worse when he went to Florence, where he started to form his own band, and it was over the rivalry for the command of this band that he may have committed his first murder, or at least given a severe beating, which in any case earned him a 2-year exile, which was then commuted into time spent at the Salviati house in Trebbio. At this point, he was sent to Rome to enter into the service of the Pope, and he would have been present at another great event in the Medici family history, the coronation of Pope Leo X, Giovanni de Medici. Another one. Here his company became a bit more refined, moving from prostitutes from lowly brothels to famous courtesans, and started to acquire a series of hangers-on who were more than happy to help him spend his money, of which he usually had very little. Indeed, later, as the commander of his own mercenary company, he would not, as was the norm, participate in the spoils of war with his soldiers, taking first a 30% cut, but would leave it all to his men, one of the reasons that he was so popular with them. As well as high-level prostitutes and parties, he also indulged in his other favorite hobby of fighting and managed to get into a pretty bad scrape with a band of Orsini, one of the more prominent Roman noble families, along with the Colonna. The Orsini, in a larger group, were crossing a bridge from one side as Giovanni and his gang were crossing from the other. What followed was a typical dumb male macho discussion about who would give way to the other. At first, things were jovial and joking, but at a certain point, the Orsini leader, a man nicknamed Barbaccio, started to get annoyed and pushed Giovanni to the ground, much to the hilarity of his men. Giovanni jumped up to his feet, and in the time it took Barbaccio to put his hand to his sword, Giovanni had stabbed and killed him. He was forced to flee the scene and was then also banished from Rome. His reputation only improved. At the age of 16, he had killed an experienced soldier. The next stop was Naples, and there the same sort of things went on: parties, banquets, taverns, women, picking fights, and bleeding money. He went back to Florence, where his family tried to get him to blow off some steam by signing him up for tournaments and jousts, where he won almost everything there was to win, with some suspecting the others had maybe let him win a bit. One person who was not at all pleased to have Giovanni back in Florence was his cousin, Lorenzo de Medici, son of Piero the Useless, son of the Magnificent. This later Lorenzo was worried that the brave and dashing Giovanni de Medici, son of the popular Giovanni of the People, could represent a rallying point for an alternative power base inside the Medici family. He needn't have worried, for Giovanni, although he would later yearn for his own little county or duchy, was never really into being an administrator. He would later threaten to stab a man who suggested he could become the Lord of Florence for having his loyalty to his homeland doubted. Also, Lorenzo would die just a few years later, and nothing gets in the way of internal family power struggles like your own death. Giovanni hung around a bit, squandering money on horses and dogs, which would always be one of his main pastimes and interest him more than his family. He started to accumulate debts, which his family, either the Medici or Salviati, would periodically have to help him out with. At this point, he was sent back to Rome and finally made himself useful. After all the brawling and fake fighting in tournaments, it was finally time for his blood baptism. The Pope put him under the command of Tristano Corso to help an ally of the Pope, the Caetani family, to get back the town of Sermoneta, southeast of Rome. Giovanni, now aged 18, was singled out for his acts of great bravery, and his reputation increased. Soon he was given command of his own company as he joined his cousin Lorenzo in the Pope's misguided attempt to take the Duchy of Urbino from Francesco della Rovere. A campaign which initially succeeded, but was then made useless when Lorenzo died and ended up just being a huge expense for the Pope and the Medici. Giovanni had shown that he could not only fight, but could also command and do it well. In November of that same 1516, he finally married his childhood companion Maria Salviati. As we mentioned, this brought together not only the Salviati and Medici, but also the two branches of the Medici family. I've spent quite a lot of time figuring out this connection and making a diagram and family trees, and when we start to get into the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, I will share that boredom with you, so don't worry. The wedding was a sumptuous affair, and someone commented, most likely exaggerating, that when the bride entered the church, her veil was still leaving her house. It seemed to Maria that her dream had come true. She was 17 and marrying the brave, handsome, and now famous man she had loved since pre-adolescence. Her joy would be short-lived. Before being an actual widow, she would be a white widow, with her husband off fighting most of the time and practically ignoring her, not even answering her letters, off with other women and enjoying his boys' club with friends such as Giovanni della Stufa, a hanger-on whom he had met in Rome. The two were really like frat boys, which included playing tricks on each other. For example, when Giovanni de Medici became interested in one of the lovers of della Stufa, Lucrezia, he orchestrated a kidnapping of the woman in which della Stufa was to be left tied naked to the bed while Lucrezia was taken to the Medici by his men. If della Stufa's men resisted, they were to be beaten but not killed, and not a hair of della Stufa was to be touched. Maria would later write to her husband after he had refused permission for her to join him in Rome. "I know well the reason why you don't want me to come to Rome. In Rome there is Giovanni della Stufa, your inseparable vile companion and organizer of orgies. You couldn't have found a better way to stop me from coming to you than by bringing della Stufa with you. That is your wish. You brought him along to spite me for fear that I might come to you. But rest assured, I would never have come anyway, well knowing that you desire others beside me, and you know very well that I know it." While Giovanni continued to spend on his dissolute lifestyle, as well as taking care of his hunting dogs, Maria had to struggle to keep the household afloat. She accused him of having left her penniless. In the granaries, there isn't a single kilo of wheat for the sale. Even the supply for the household is running out. Giovanni, as was often the case, did not even bother to answer. Soon after the wedding, Giovanni was called back to Urbino, where della Rovere had taken his duchy back, and managed to defeat him again to get the duchy back for Lorenzo de' Medici. But we know this was a waste of time, since Lorenzo died in 1519. This was the guy to whom Machiavelli dedicated his Prince, and Lorenzo snubbed the writer, practically ignoring him, since he had been gifted 2 new dogs with which he was much more taken than with some old book. For one Medici that was leaving the scene, Giovanni de Medici and Maria Salviati managed to spend enough time together to bring another one on the scene around a month and a half after the death of the Duke of Urbino. Indeed, on the 12th of June 1519, their first and only son was born. Celebrations in Florence went wild, especially with huge bonfires being lit. They were seen at a distance, and despite not knowing exactly what was really going on, but not wanting to miss out on the fun, those who saw them lit more, to the point that the fire soon reached across the Apennines and to the coast on the other side of the peninsula. When the news reached Forlì, An old man by the name of Marc Antonio Baldraccani must have smiled to himself. He was an old, now retired secretary of Caterina Sforza and had remained loyal to his lady. Now he could toast to the birth of her grandson. Giovanni presented his son to the Pope, asking that the boy be put under the pontiff's protection. He accepted on the condition that the baby be named Cosimo. The court astronomers noted that he had an ascendant in Capricorn. I have no idea what that means, but it was just like the emperors Augustus and Charles V, so it must have been good. The boy's mother also consulted a fortune teller who said that he would have a future of honor and glory. We'll just have to wait and see. Thank you very much for listening. Grazie mille. A History of Italy is a Sentire Media podcast, hosted and created by me, Mike Corradi, and produced by my wonderful, superb Patreon supporters, whom I would like to thank, starting from the first third of the Margherita Hack and Galileo Galilei level, and they are Alison H., Annie, Aurora T., Benjamin W., Karsten, Catherine C., C. Lane, Cindy M., Chris H., Cospia Fanboy, David M., Dean V., Demetrio M., Dennis K., Dennis S., Dominique T., Edward J., Edward S., Emily B., and Eric W., and of course the tippy top Maria Montessori and Dante Alighieri level, Lisa K., Peter W., David L., David C., Sen, David A., Karen D., Bridget T., Dallas R., Joseph V., Stephen G., and Julian. Remember to send in your contributions for the 208th anniversary episode. And if you want to just get in touch and say hello, make comments, ask questions, share intimate secrets, you can do so. hello@ahistoryofitaly.com or on social media, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Once again, thank you very much for listening, and until next time, arrivederci.